What if the most dangerous man in post-war Europe was not a Soviet general, not a communist spy, not a revolutionary, but an American hero, decorated with medals, worshipped by his troops, and absolutely convinced that the real war had not yet been won? In the spring and summer of 1945, as the guns fell silent across a shattered continent, one man refused to accept that the fighting was over. General George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the legendary Third Army, stood at the threshold of a decision that could have ignited a Third World War before the Second had even officially ended. He had driven his tanks from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, crossing rivers, crushing divisions, and defying every military convention along the way. He had slapped a soldier in a hospital tent in Sicily and nearly ended his own career. He had outmaneuvered Rommel's Ghost, broken the encirclement at Bastogne, and reached Czechoslovakia before being ordered to stop. And now, with Soviet forces consolidating their grip on Eastern Europe, Patton looked east and saw not an ally, but the next enemy. The question that haunted the final months of his life was not whether he was right, but whether any single man, no matter how brilliant, had the right to decide that for the world. If this story is already pulling you in, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves real history. Then drop a comment telling us what you already knew about Patton and what surprises you. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who deserve to hear them. George Patton was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a family steeped in military tradition stretching back to the American Revolution and the Civil War. His grandfather, George Smith Patton I, had died leading a Confederate charge at the Third Battle of Winchester in September 1864, and that legacy of martial sacrifice was woven into George's identity from childhood. He grew up reading Caesar's Gallic Wars and Homer's Iliad as if they were instruction manuals, not literature. He struggled with dyslexia, failed his first year at West Point, and had to repeat it, but that setback only sharpened his ferocious determination. He competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall and placing among the best in the world in equestrian events and fencing. He studied under the great French cavalryman adjutant Charles Clary, refined his swordsmanship to an art form, and in 1916 served under General John "Black Jack" Pershing in the punitive expedition into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa. By the time America entered the First World War, Patton had already developed a philosophy of war that was almost mystical in its intensity. Speed, aggression, shock, and the relentless offensive were not merely tactics, they were the moral imperatives of leadership. He was, in every sense, a warrior formed by history before he ever made it. When the Second World War began reshaping the map of the globe, Patton had already spent years in the intellectual wilderness of an interwar army that had little use for armor theorists and aggressive thinkers. But the fall of France in June 1940 and the terrifying efficiency of German blitzkrieg tactics changed everything almost overnight. Patton was given command of the 2nd Armored Division at Fort Benning, Georgia, and threw himself into the work with volcanic energy. His exercises were brutal, realistic, and enormously effective at forging soldiers from civilians. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Patton was already one of the most prepared armored commanders in the American military. His first major test came in North Africa, where after the humiliating American defeat at the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally selected Patton to take command of the demoralized II Corps and restore its fighting spirit. In just 2 weeks, Patton transformed a shaken force into an aggressive, disciplined army that began pushing the Germans back. His methods were brutal and unorthodox. He fined soldiers for not wearing their helmets, demanded salutes under fire, and ruled by a combination of terror, inspiration, and sheer force of personality. North Africa was the proving ground, and Patton passed every test it threw at him. Sicily in the summer of 1943 became both Patton's greatest triumph and the theater of his most damaging controversy. Operation Husky, launched on July 9 to 10, 1943, placed him in command of the American 7th Army alongside British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army. Patton chafed furiously under the operational plan that gave Montgomery the main axis of advance toward Messina, while the Americans were assigned a supporting role protecting the British flank. Rather than accept that subordinate position, Patton launched an unauthorized drive toward Palermo in the northwest of the island, capturing the city on July 22 in a blaze of publicity and local adulation. He then pivoted east and raced Montgomery to Messina in a rivalry that became legendary. But on August 3, 1943, visiting the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Patton encountered Private Charles Kull, a soldier diagnosed with exhaustion and psychoneurosis. Patton slapped him across the face with his gloves, called him a coward, and ordered him back to the front. A week later, on August 10, he did it again to Private Paul Bennett at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. War correspondent Drew Pearson broke the story publicly in November 1943, creating a firestorm that nearly ended Patton's career permanently. Only Eisenhower's personal intervention, and the argument that America could not afford to waste Patton's genius, kept him in uniform. The slapping incidents cost Patton nearly a year of operational command during one of the war's most critical phases. While his peers were planning and executing the Normandy invasion, he was kept in England, humiliatingly used as the central figure in Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main Allied landing would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Germans, who considered Patton the most dangerous American commander, kept entire armored divisions in reserve near Calais waiting for him long after the real landings on June 6, 1944, had already established a beachhead, a deception that arguably saved thousands of Allied lives. When Patton finally arrived in France and took command of the Third Army on August 1, 1944, the effect was electric. Within days, his tanks were tearing through the German lines in a breakout that stunned even optimistic Allied planners. From August through December 1944, the Third Army advanced further, faster, and with fewer casualties relative to territory gained than any comparable force in the war. Patton crossed the Seine, liberated much of Brittany, rolled through Lorraine, and was driving toward the Rhine when fuel shortages imposed by Eisenhower's broad front strategy brought his advance to a grinding halt in September 1944, a decision Patton never forgave and never stopped arguing against. The Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944, with a massive German offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, became the defining moment of Patton's legend. When German forces surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, Belgium, and Allied commanders were scrambling to respond, Patton made a claim that seemed almost impossible. He could disengage 3 divisions from their current offensive, pivot 90 degrees north, and drive to Bastogne's relief within 48 hours. Eisenhower's staff were skeptical to the point of incredulity. Such a maneuver would have taken most commanders weeks to plan and execute. But Patton had already prepared 3 separate contingency plans before the meeting even began, a fact he revealed with barely concealed theatrical satisfaction. True to his word, the Third Army pivoted on December 18 to 19, and the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division cracked through the German encirclement and reached Bastogne on December 26, 1944, relieving the trapped defenders and helping to seal the failure of Germany's last great offensive in the West. It was, by any measure, one of the most astonishing logistical and operational feats in American military history. Yet even in triumph, Patton's mind was already racing ahead, not to the celebration of victory, but to what he believed was the next and greater conflict waiting beyond the Elbe River. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Army drove deep into Germany and then into Austria and Czechoslovakia, Patton was becoming increasingly vocal about what he saw as the real strategic disaster unfolding before him. In conversations with aides, fellow officers, and anyone who would listen, he expressed his conviction that the Soviet Union was not an ally but a future enemy, and that the moment to confront that enemy was now, while American forces were still mobilized, battle-hardened, and in the field. On April 15, 1945, he wrote in his diary that he thought it was possible to push the Soviets back to their pre-war borders without enormous difficulty if the political will existed to do it. When Czech citizens in Pilsen greeted his troops as liberators in May 1945, and when he learned that Eisenhower had ordered him to halt at Pilsen and not advance to Prague, a decision driven by political agreements at Yalta, Patton was barely able to contain his rage. He believed the abandonment of Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe to Soviet domination was a moral catastrophe and a strategic blunder of historic proportions. He was not entirely wrong in his analysis, though he was catastrophically wrong in his proposed solution. The man who had spent his whole life mastering war had no comprehension of the atomic age dawning around him, no understanding of the devastation another conflict would bring, and no patience for the diplomacy that was the only alternative to annihilation. The summer of 1945 brought victory in Europe and the beginning of occupation duties that Patton was temperamentally entirely unsuited to perform. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria on May 31, 1945, and almost immediately began making decisions that alarmed his superiors and horrified the political establishment in Washington. The central controversy was denazification, the Allied policy of removing former Nazi party members from positions of authority in German civil society, government, and infrastructure. Patton resisted this policy on pragmatic grounds, arguing that the Nazis were the only Germans with administrative experience and that removing them would create chaos in Bavaria. On August 22, 1945, at a press conference in Bad Tolz, Germany, he made the catastrophic remark that the Nazi Party was just like the Democratic and Republican parties back home, a statement that caused an international scandal and sent shockwaves through the halls of power in Washington and around the world. Eisenhower summoned Patton to Frankfurt and reprimanded him severely. Patton was also believed to have expressed sympathy for using German Wehrmacht units alongside American forces to fight the Soviets, a notion that, in the immediate aftermath of a war that had killed tens of millions, was received as either delusional or dangerous, possibly both. Now we reach the very heart of this story, and if you have come this far, you already know this is unlike any history lesson you learned in school. Subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with a friend who needs to understand how close the world came to something unthinkable. Leave a comment below about what surprised you most. We read every single one. Harry S. Truman had become president on April 12, 1945, following Franklin Roosevelt's death at Warm Springs, Georgia, thrust without preparation into the most consequential position on Earth at the most consequential moment in human history. Truman was in many ways the antithesis of Patton, a former Missouri haberdasher, a product of the Pendergast political machine, a man of modest formal education who had nonetheless served with distinction as an artillery captain in France during World War I. He had profound respect for military service but absolutely no tolerance for military officers who confused their battlefield authority with political decision-making power. Truman understood, with the instinctive clarity of a politician, something that Patton could never grasp, that in a democracy, civilians controlled the military, not the other way around, and that this principle was not a bureaucratic inconvenience but the very foundation of the Republic. When reports of Patton's statements about the Soviets, his resistance to denazification, and his barely concealed advocacy for a new war reached the White House, Truman's response was cold, measured, and absolute. The era of tolerating Patton's insubordination was over. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the force he had built and led to some of the greatest military achievements in American history. The official reason given was that Patton was needed to lead the 15th Army, which was essentially a historical documentation unit with no combat function, a demotion so obvious it required no explanation. Patton accepted the transfer with a public dignity that masked what his diary and letters revealed as profound grief, humiliation, and bitter anger. He wrote to his wife Beatrice that he felt he was being punished for telling the truth, and in his own mind that was precisely what had happened. The America he believed in, the America that rewarded martial virtue above all else, that valued winning above diplomacy, that saw strength as its own justification, was being replaced by something he did not recognize and could not respect. He toured the concentration camps, was genuinely horrified by what he saw, and yet somehow managed to combine that horror with continued resistance to denazification, a contradiction that spoke to the profound confusion of his final months. He applied for reassignment to the Pacific Theater, but the war with Japan ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, removing that escape route as well. Patton was running out of wars. The man who had survived bullets, artillery, the Sicilian controversy, the slapping incidents, and nearly every catastrophe the battlefield could produce, met his end in the most mundane of circumstances. On December 9, 1945, in Mannheim, Germany, on a quiet Sunday morning drive to go pheasant hunting with his Chief of Staff General Hobart Gay, Patton's staff car, a 1938 Cadillac Model 75, was struck by a United States Army truck driven by Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson at a railroad crossing. The collision was low speed, almost trivial by the standards of the violence Patton had witnessed, but the angle of impact threw Patton forward with tremendous force, and he struck his head on the metal partition separating the passenger compartment from the driver's area. He was paralyzed from the neck down almost immediately. Rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, attended by some of the finest military medical personnel available, Patton lingered for 12 days in a state of alert and lucid awareness. He could speak, he could think, but he could not move. He told his wife Beatrice, who flew from the United States to be at his bedside, that he did not think he would survive. General Gay and others who visited him reported that he was calm, philosophical, almost serene, as if the warrior who had always courted death had finally made his peace with it. George Smith Patton Jr. died on December 21, 1945, at 1755, in Heidelberg, Germany. He was 60 years old. He had never stood trial for his statements. He had never launched his unauthorized war. He had never faced the consequences his enemies had hoped for or the vindication his admirers believed he deserved. He was buried, at his own request, among his soldiers, not at West Point, not in some grand national cemetery befitting his rank, but at the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial in Ham, Luxembourg, alongside the men of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. The grave is marked simply, as he wished, among thousands of others. Harry Truman, who had effectively ended Patton's active military career and who understood better than almost anyone why it had been necessary, nevertheless acknowledged Patton's genius without equivocation. The Soviet threat that Patton had warned about did materialize. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the Cold War began, and the world lived for 40 years under the shadow of nuclear annihilation that any premature military confrontation in 1945 might have made immediate and total. Whether Patton was a prophet who was silenced or a brilliant man who could not see beyond the battlefield remains one of history's most genuinely unresolved debates. The story of George Patton and Harry Truman is not simply the story of a clash between two men, it is the story of a civilization deciding what kind of power it wanted to be. It is the story of the terrible tension between martial courage and political wisdom, between the soldier's clarity and the statesman's ambiguity, between the instinct to act and the necessity to restrain. Patton died believing the wrong decisions had been made. Truman lived until 1972, long enough to see the Cold War become a permanent feature of global reality, long enough to know that the atomic bomb, which he had ordered dropped, had changed the nature of war so fundamentally that men like Patton, for all their genius, belonged to a world that no longer existed. The world Patton wanted to fight for could not have survived the fight he wanted to start. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all, that history is sometimes saved not by the men who charge forward, but by the men who have the strength, and the foresight, and the democratic conscience, to say, that is not your war. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you never knew, then this is your moment. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, like this video to help it reach more viewers, and share it with someone in your life who deserves to understand how fragile the peace we inherited really was. Drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Was it Patton's plans to fight the Soviets, his removal from command, or something else entirely? Every comment, every share, every subscription is how these forgotten stories survive. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes, and the only protection against its darkest verses is knowing them by heart.